Fran Bow is exactly the kind of game that I, living in today's gaming landscape, always hope and pray to find, but that never quite seem to come up as often as they should. It's a retro format that is true to its roots while also embracing modern thinking, a true blue point-and-click adventure game that might be the most honest throwback to the olden times that I've played since Night of the Rabbit. I really love point-and-clicks, even if a lot of them still carry over problems from the old games that make them kind of hard to want to spring for. As a game, Fran Bow does a good job of streamlining the wandering and seemingly endless experimenting that comes with the genre, but it certainly doesn't skimp on the fairy tale flight of fancy attitude. That, of course, is to say Grimm's fairy tale flight of fancy. The game takes place in the mid-40s with an aesthetic to match. Everything comes with a kind of bleakness that evokes an American Gothic feel, which suits the child in peril theme eerily perfectly. And wouldn't you know it if this game isn't one of the most raw and unapologetic horror games I've ever played. Fran is a happy young girl who lives a comfortable life with her parents and her cat named Mr. Midnight, until she finds herself beholden to her parents' murdered corpses. When fleeing her home, she eventually passes out from exhaustion somewhere in the forest. She is found and subsequently brought to the Oswald Asylum for Children. Now her only goal is to escape the asylum, find her cat, and get life back to a sort of normal. So as far as orphan stories go, it's less Charles Dickens and more Neil Gaiman writing Alice in Wonderland as illustrated by Edward Gorey. What's great about Fran Bow is that it seems to possess the amount of writing that other or older point-and-clicks always seem to lack. Rather than relying on the player to click around and try using everything on everything else, there is enough dialogue, internal or otherwise, that can help the player approach any given problem from more perspectives than just whatever headspace the designer was in when they were making the game. You know, in case that's a bit too hard for some players to connect to. As such, I found it wasn't necessary to use a guide, as is often required with some of the more demanding games of the genre, though I will admit this isn't exactly universal. The game also seems to have a pretty admirable difficulty curve to it, which is a bit of a weird prospect, seeing as how the only thing point-and-clicks have going for them in the difficulty department is separating the clues from the solutions in more and more frustrating ways. So yes, confession time, I did use a guide to get through a bunch of the second half of this game. Despite how creative and fun the game is, it is not beyond the occasional breaks in flow or tone that can really throw a player off, and at times stop play completely while the player says, "Ugh, really?" The kind of thing that has the player going through the big finale story capper, basically the closest thing a point-and-click has to a final boss room, moving into the wonderfully subversive epilogue, only to begin a puzzle that requires our character to casually saunter back through the boss room, all of the endgame characters just staring at you blankly like you forgot your bag lunch on the way to work or something, and then you just keep going forward like they didn't just leg sweep all of the tension right out from under the big culmination of the story. But that's all beside the point. Fran Bow is one of the strongest contenders for best written game I have played in quite some time. You can tell that the game just revels in defying your expectations, featuring fleshed out characters who help or hinder your progress for reasons that truly feel are their own, a twisty and intriguing plot that stays true to itself instead of trying to meet its audience with overused conventions or tired tropes, and there's also a talking cat. So yeah, this game's a win. And, well, remember when I referred to this game as a raw and unapologetic horror game? Yeah, this game really comes out of the gate swinging in that regard. A big part of the story, and what turns out to be a chief mechanic in terms of gameplay, is Fran's medication, which she is able to take a dose of at any time. When she does, she is suddenly surrounded by disturbing visions or hallucinations of, well, just some really unfriendly stuff. Body parts and viscera just kind of lying around, and monsters that had some real vision and effort put into them. All in all, just not a very nice place to be in, but wouldn't you know it, Fran is able to use this state of mind, which the game later refers to as ultra-reality, to solve puzzles that are otherwise unsolvable in the real world. So yeah, the player needs to be willing to subject themselves to this stuff on a pretty regular basis in this game. There is no accounting for what kind of horror you will find on the other side of reality in any given room, and so dropping a pill really is a way by which the player is telling the game, "Alright, jump scare me," which the game takes full advantage of. There is a roughly 2 to 3 second ramp up to the environment change, and there is a scare cue every time. All of this in addition to whatever fresh horror is waiting for you on the other side of reality. The overall style of this game just screams of Edward Gorey, and to see such blatant scenes of uncanny horror rendered in such a style never gets easy. I almost started to feel bad or guilty for letting myself get desensitized to it all. So the game is perfectly willing to bludgeon you over the head with its horror, and even when it's not throwing true blue jump scares at you, the awareness of the ultra reality created for me an ever-present knowledge that any room you are in is in fact haunted. Every time I dropped out of ultra reality, I was overcome with morbid curiosity regarding what I wasn't seeing in any given space or room. The game is basically one of those fancy knives that can slice right through a penny but still cut a tomato. It is a functionally and mechanically scary game, but very quickly turns around and becomes the intangible mirror looking back at the real world kind of horror game with the steady hand of a surgeon. While ultra reality establishes a very formulaic approach to this game's method of scaring the piss out of you, it is the first chapter of the game that its real power is most clearly on display. When Fran drops one of her pills, we can see all of the horrors that lurk just beneath the surface of our reality, and there are truths there that are made available to us that really drive home the power of this game. Revelations about the history of the other children in the asylum, and visual representations of the kinds of demons that can develop in a place like this if left unchecked, are the most clear and powerful statement the game is making. The truly disturbing visions we see mounting on top of an already uncomfortable otherness that accompanies relating to the mentally infirm, ultra reality takes these characters' traumas and manifests them in a literal sense right in front of us. Characters' heads are removed, sleeping bodies are replaced with skeletal remains. It's all quite disturbing and brings a kind of reality to us about the experiences of others. Everything is represented and indeed exaggerated in the ultra reality, driving home the horrors that haunt the lives of those around us that we can't always see. The difficult topics in this game are explained behind this new context, but when we reach the basement of the asylum and we find ourselves immersed in the final destination of some of the more troubled children, things start to change. Lobotomized, isolated, neglected, realities put in place by human beings upon other human beings, bringing about a moment that had me starting to question which reality was truly more terrifying. The constructed darkness we escape to when there's nowhere else to go, or the darkness that hangs over the very idea of humanity itself. I found Chapter 1 to be the most affecting chapter of the game, and it really hasn't left me since I played it. I see the significance of the rest of the game and the statements it's making, though most of the rest of the game shifts to focus more on the story as we progress. And it's a great story. It's not afraid to defy expectations, and as a whole it comes off as wonderfully well-rounded and stays nice and disturbing, if that's what you're into. Eventually we start to see just how far into the realm of otherworldly fantasy this game is willing to go, and really tips its hand when we end up in the magical kingdom of Ithersta, a world populated by giant insects and plant people. I will say that I found Ultra Reality's exclusion from this chapter of the game to be an interesting choice. Obviously it's not needed, as we have found ourselves as far away from the asylum setting as possible, literally being in a fantasy forest kingdom and Fran herself having in fact been turned into a living tree. Mechanically speaking, Ultra Reality would have proved cumbersome here, as we have found a new reality-altering game idea in which we are able to cycle through the seasons at will, though I will point out that the relief one might feel from not needing the ever-present darkness to escape into is given some baggage by the chapter's title, Vegetative State, which of course brings a whole new context to our literally being turned into a plant. Yeah, there is no escaping this game. What I think speaks to this game's power the most is that it's not a story of hopelessness, as horror games so often tend to be. The way the game is written flies in the face of the very genre it has conquered, and I respect that. The only failure state in the game is not knowing how to progress, so there's no danger for the game to dwell on. It's not a surviving despite story, rather an accomplishing in spite of story, personified perfectly by its protagonist. Fran is a 10-year-old girl facing down the kind of horror that most of us can't even imagine, but never loses her adventurous spirit or passionate curiosity. The friends she makes along the way are actual friends, and they come with their own baggage and backstories. The game is just itching to show us all the cool and creepy stuff it has waiting for us, with the only terrifying mystery becoming what they could possibly come up with next. I'm only disappointed I didn't play this game when it came out so I could shout it from the rooftops as my game of the year last year. There is so much going on here that is both affecting and effective, and even though it's only been a week since I played it, as of this writing, I'm sure this game is going to stick with me for a long time, and I wouldn't have it any other way.